In August 1969, Jimi Hendrix closed Woodstock at dawn on the final morning. Most of the crowd of 400,000 had already gone home. He walked out anyway and played The Star-Spangled Banner to whoever was left, a performance still considered one of the most significant in rock history. He was 26 years old. By 1969, he was one of rock's highest-paid performers. He had roughly $20,000 in his personal bank accounts. That number was not an accident. It was the result of a business arrangement that had been designed from the beginning to make sure Jimi Hendrix never knew how much he was worth. He was born in Seattle in 1942, the son of a landscaper named Al. His childhood was unstable. His mother died when he was 15, and he spent years moving between family members. He dropped out of high school. In 1961, after police caught him riding in a stolen car, he was given a choice: prison or the United States Army. He enlisted and was assigned to the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. He was discharged in 1962, a short service, and left the military with a guitar and no plan. What followed was 4 years of drifting. He toured as a sideman for Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, and others, bands that paid him almost nothing and owned everything he recorded. By the fall of 1965, he was in New York, broke and looking for work. Ed Chalpin ran a company called PPX Enterprises out of a Manhattan recording studio. He had a sideline in signing musicians to cheap recording deals and collecting royalties if they ever amounted to anything. On October 15, 1965, he put a contract in front of Jimi Hendrix. The advance was $1. The royalty rate was 1%. In exchange, Hendrix agreed to record exclusively for PPX for 3 years. Hendrix signed. He needed the work. Over the following months, he recorded with a small soul act called Curtis Knight and the Squires. The recordings were unremarkable. Chalpin filed them away and waited. He would not have to wait long. In July 1966, a man named Chaz Chandler walked into Café Wah in Greenwich Village. Chandler was the bassist for The Animals, a Newcastle band that had scored a #1 hit in both the United States and the United Kingdom with House of the Rising Sun in 1964. He had come to New York looking for artists to manage and produce. He heard Hendrix play that night and flew him to London that September. Chandler brought with him a business partner, Michael Jeffrey. Jeffrey had been the Animals' manager since 1963. He had worked in British military intelligence before building a string of clubs in Newcastle, most notably the Club A Go-Go. He had business interests in Spain and a talent for structuring financial arrangements that were deliberately opaque. When the Animals' members later reflected on their time under his management, the common thread was that the money had never added up. They had scored multiple hits and toured relentlessly, and the accounting was always somehow unclear. The two men divided the work. Chandler understood music. He produced, he directed sessions, he shaped the sound that would make Hendrix a star. Jeffrey understood the business, booking, deal-making, the financial architecture around an artist. Together, they moved fast. The Jimi Hendrix experience was formed within weeks of Hendrix arriving in London. Jeffrey and Chandler formalized their management arrangement with Hendrix in late 1966. Their commission was far above what the industry considered standard, and that commission was only the beginning. Within the business structure Jeffrey built around Hendrix, the earnings would not flow directly to Hendrix. They would be routed through a company called Yameta Limited, incorporated in the Bahamas. Major streams of Hendrix's income, tour revenue, recording advances, royalties, passed through Yameta before any of it reached the artist. What came back to Hendrix was an allowance, enough to live on, not enough to track. In the years when all of this was being set up, it didn't look unreasonable. Hendrix was unknown, he needed management, and management needed infrastructure. What it looked like later, when the money was real and the accounting still made no sense, was something else entirely. Hey Joe was released in December 1966. Purple Haze in March 1967. Are You Experienced arrived in May 1967 and reached #2 on the UK charts. Axis, Bold as Love followed in December. Electric Ladyland in 1968 hit #1 in the United States. Each record sold more than the last. Each tour grossed more than the previous one. By 1968, Hendrix was commanding some of the highest performance fees in rock, and his touring income was growing with every show, and underneath all of it, the Chalpine problem. When Ed Chalpin learned that the broke musician he had signed for $1 in 1965 was now one of the most famous people on earth, he filed suit in 1967. The PPX contract was real. Hendrix had signed it. Chalpin had a legitimate legal claim, and he pursued it aggressively on both sides of the Atlantic. The legal settlements gave Chalpin what he had always been waiting for: the right to release Hendrix material without the artist's involvement. Get That Feeling. Curtis Knight recordings, carrying Hendrix's name, appeared in December 1967, in the middle of his peak moment, published by a man who had paid $1 for the privilege. It didn't stop there. Chalpin continued releasing Curtis Knight recordings for years, putting Hendrix's name prominently on covers designed to draw buyers who wanted the real thing. Hendrix had no role in selecting this material, had not approved it, and had almost no meaningful financial control over any of it. Every new release appeared alongside his authorized work on store shelves. Everyone was a reminder that a 3-year contract signed for a single dollar in 1965 would follow him for the rest of his career, and that the music industry contained men who had been waiting patiently for him to become worth something. The American side of the Chalpin dispute would follow his estate past his death. By 1968, Chas Chandler had sold his stake in the management back to Jeffrey and walked away. What Chandler said in later interviews was that he could not get straight answers about where the money was going. He was a producer at heart and did not want to spend his time fighting about accounting. So he left, taking a payout from Jeffrey for his share. Jeffrey now had sole control. Hendrix worked almost constantly. In 1968 alone, he played more than 100 shows. He recorded. He toured the United States, headlined festivals in Europe, and generated income at a scale that should have made him extraordinarily wealthy. People close to Hendrix in those years recall him asking repeatedly where the money was going and getting answers that were always complicated and never fully satisfying. He was not naive, but the financial structures were layered enough, and his legal exposure from existing contracts complicated enough that his options were limited. What made it harder to fight was that Jeffrey had positioned himself as the only person who understood the commercial side of the operation. The management contract was signed. The Yamada structure was already in place. The label relationships, the touring infrastructure, the booking arrangements, all of it ran through Jeffrey. Walking away was not a simple matter of firing a manager. It meant potentially losing control of everything that had been built around him. He had been made dependent on the system that was taking from him. What came back to him was not proportionate to what he was generating. He had lawyers' fees, management taking its share, and an advance against a studio he hadn't finished building, all deducted from royalties he could not audit. He kept working. In 1969, Jeffrey arranged for Warner Brothers and Reprise Records to advance several $100,000 to build a recording studio at 52 West 8th Street in Greenwich Village, the former site of a nightclub called the Generation Club. The studio was called Electric Lady. The advance came against Hendrix's future royalties, which meant the cost of building it would be deducted from money Hendrix was owed before he ever received it. Electric Lady Studios officially opened in late August 1970. Hendrix had been recording there for weeks by then. The studio had been taking shape around him through the summer. He was dead 3 weeks after the opening. In the months before his death, Hendrix had become increasingly direct about wanting out. He had reached out to attorneys in New York about restructuring his management. He had told people in his circle he was done with Jeffrey. He had also begun talking about what it would take to run his own label, to be the kind of artist who controlled what he put out and kept what he earned. Electric Lady Studios was part of that vision. He had designed it to be his studio, his base of operations, the beginning of something he owned. He walked into it in the summer of 1970 and recorded there for weeks. The opening party was held in late August. He left for a European tour shortly after, played his last concert in Germany on September 6th, and returned to London. None of the plans moved fast enough. On the night of September 17th, 1970, Hendrix was in London. He spent the evening at a party and returned to the flat of his girlfriend, Monica Danneman, at the Samarkand Hotel on Lansdowne Crescent in Notting Hill. He took 9 Vesparax sleeping tablets. The standard dose was half a tablet. Danneman found him unresponsive early on September 18th. He was taken to St. Mary Abbott's Hospital in Kensington, where he died later that morning. He was 27 years old. The coroner's inquest, held on September the 28th, returned an open verdict. The official cause of death was inhalation of vomit due to barbiturate intoxication. An open verdict means the evidence was insufficient to determine whether death was accidental. He left behind no will. Jeffrey outlived Hendrix by less than 3 years. On March 5, 1973, he boarded Iberia Airlines Flight 504 in Palma de Mallorca, bound for London. Over Nantes, France, the plane collided in mid-air with another aircraft. All 68 people aboard the Iberia flight died. The offshore accounts, the Yameta records, the documentation of what had actually flowed through the Bahamian structure during Hendrix's career, all of it died with him, or became so difficult to unravel that no one ever produced a clean accounting of how much had moved and where it had gone. Because Hendrix died without a will and had no spouse or children, his estate passed to his father. Al Hendrix was a 51-year-old Seattle landscaper who had a complicated relationship with his son, and he had been almost entirely outside Jimmy's professional career. He now held the legal rights to one of the most valuable music catalogs in the world, or would have if those rights had been cleanly organized and accountable. What Al Hendrix actually inherited was a legal tangle, corporate entities in the Bahamas, an unresolved claim from Ed Chalpin, royalty disputes with Warner Brothers, almost nothing liquid, a name that was worth a fortune and an estate that had nearly none of it. A lawyer named Leo Branton Jr. was retained to manage the estate around 1974. A settlement was eventually reached with Warner Brothers and other parties that gave the estate access to some assets. Al Hendrix began receiving income from his son's recordings. He trusted Branton with that work for nearly 2 decades. What became apparent over time, through Al's own investigation and through attorneys he eventually hired, was that the deals Branton had made to manage and license the estate had not been made in Al's interest. Recording rights and publishing rights had been sold or licensed at below-market rates. The financial arrangements had directed substantial fees to parties connected to the management, rather than to the heir who owned the catalog. Al Hendrix had been receiving a fraction of what the estate was generating, from a man he had hired to protect it. He had not suspected it for most of those 2 decades. He received checks. He attended meetings. He had no financial background, no music industry experience, and no particular reason to doubt what he was being told. It was only when he began asking detailed questions, and eventually hired accountants and attorneys who were working for him rather than for the estate, that the picture came into focus. By then, significant rights had already been sold or licensed on terms that took years of litigation to address. Jimi Hendrix had been exploited twice. Once while he was alive, once after he was gone. Al Hendrix filed suit in 1993. The claims covered fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and the misappropriation of his son's recordings and publishing rights. The settlement was reached in July 1995. It returned to Al Hendrix what had been taken, the master recordings and the publishing rights to his son's music. That same year, Al Hendrix founded Experience Hendrix LLC to manage the estate going forward. His daughter Janie Hendrix joined the company, and after Al's death in April 2002, became its president and CEO. Al Hendrix was 82 years old when he died. He had spent the final decade of his life winning back what his son had built. The estate Jimi Hendrix left behind with $20,000 in personal accounts is now estimated to be worth approximately $175 million. Experience Hendrix LLC generates millions of dollars per year in royalties, licensing fees, and merchandise. Jimi Hendrix from Seattle runs it. Chalpin pursued his claims against the estate for years after Hendrix's death, eventually collecting royalties from posthumous releases under the terms of his legal victories. The recordings he made with Curtis Knight, produced under that $1 contract, have been reissued and repackaged in various forms ever since. Jeffrey died over France without ever being held accountable. The full amount he extracted through Yameta was never publicly established. It is possible no one will ever know with precision. Branton died in 2013. What remains is the music. Purple Haze, Voodoo Child, Little Wing, The Star-Spangled Banner, played at Woodstock to whoever was still there at dawn. The man who launched Jimi Hendrix stole everything he could reach. He missed one thing: the recordings themselves. The music Jeffrey ran through a Bahamian shell company. The catalog Chalpine tried to dilute. The publishing rights that were nearly lost twice, all of it belongs to the Hendrix family now. Those came home.